So next up I'm going to do a video of this Commodore 64 cartridge game, and this is the Great Giana Sisters. Here we go. So there's someone on eBay that sells a lot of these cartridges, and they all have this, and they all have different custom PCBs. I did do a video of the Super Mario Brothers conversion to the Commodore 64 in an older video, which is a similar sort of thing. But you can get lots of different games on these custom-made cartridges, but they don't come in cases for some reason, which would be better for the actual cartridge. But I do have one or two other Commodore 64 cartridges. I've got Prince of Persia on cartridge, and I think this wasn't released on the Commodore 64 originally, so this is a homebrew version of Prince of Persia, and it's a homebrew cartridge as well. And I also have this copy of Ghosts and Goblins, which isn't a homebrew version of the game, it's the officially released Elite version of the game. But the cartridge itself is a homebrew thing, because the game wasn't released on cartridge originally. I tend to stick to cassette tapes nowadays when I buy Commodore 64 games. I bought a floppy disk drive and a couple of disc games, but floppy disks are really expensive and most of them simply don't work. So I don't think it's worth the bother anymore, and so I just go for either cartridges or tapes. But for this particular game, it's obviously better to get a cartridge like this, because the tape version of the game is probably going to be about £500 if you ever see it on eBay. So I'm never going to spend that sort of money. I can't remember how much I spent on this. But anyway, let's plug this in and play some Great Giana Sisters. This is some very somber music, isn't it? What I'm going to do, I'm going to include the loader tune at the end of this video. Because this is a cartridge, it doesn't include the loader. And some Commodore 64 games have got loader tunes. You know, this doesn't really look like a typical Commodore 64 game, actually. In my experience of playing Commodore 64 games, they often look really chunky and ugly, but the main character is actually not well defined. But this looks pretty good. Obviously, it's not even worth mentioning that it's a copy of Super Mario Brothers. It almost looks like a ROM hack. I do like the music in this game though. It's obviously a very home computer type of game. So you've even got this bit here where you can just run along the top of the level. There's nothing up here. Weird design. Those boulders actually sap your time away. If one of them falls on your head and you get stuck inside it, it just makes your time move faster. So be careful with that. Oh, there we go. The collision detection was a little bit too good there. I haven't actually played this game all that much. The little I did play it, I found it to be too easy. I don't know if there was supposed to be something in that block there. I do quite like this game though. This is one of those games that's very suited to the Commodore 64 above other home computers. It's quite well suited to the Amiga as well. And I think it was also on the Atari ST and the Amstrad CPC. It was never released on the Spectrum, but it might have been that the Spectrum version was a little bit behind in development and just never found a release. But it does play very well, even though sometimes it can be a bit awkward having to press up on the D-pad. But you've even got those end of level bosses that can just be jumped over. This is very, very much like Super Mario Brothers. But really, there was no shame about that sort of thing back then. A lot of very early computer games were based on games like Space Invaders, Pac-Man and Frogger and things like that. So I guess certain companies like Time Warp Productions just thought, yeah, let's just make something based on Super Mario Brothers. That's the current popular thing. I'm pretty sure that's a secret area down there. There's a little kind of blue thing. Yeah, oh, there we go. It seems to me that there was a big difference between making games for home computers and making console games. Or at least making console games for Nintendo, and then later on for Sega. So if you was making a game for a home computer like the Commodore 64, unless you were very lucky, you would be dictated to by a publisher. And a lot of publishers would tell you, basically, this is how long you have, just give me something I can put in a box and I can have on the shop shelves in a month, and that's that. And so it's basically up to the developer to get it all done, and that may not necessarily leave time to test the game very well. And if it was an arcade conversion, you might not have enough time to fit the whole game into that development time. But making games for consoles, like say for instance if you was Nintendo making a game for the NES, their philosophy would be to make the game as good as possible, and they would actually spend time just playing the game and testing the game. not just bug testing the game, but actually testing the controls of the game to make sure they feel okay, testing the levels to make sure there's no unwinnable positions that you can get yourself into, and getting other people to play the game so you can sort of tweak the level design based on what players are likely to do and things like that. And so it was very, very different, and I think ultimately Nintendo ended up with the best games. But it was different in the way that Nintendo would expect to sell millions of copies of a game and make money. But if you was releasing a game for the Commodore 64, you wouldn't make very much money. Even if you released the same game on 5 or 6 different machines, you might not make very much money from it. And so it was all sort of geared towards getting games made as quickly as possible so you could move on to the next thing. I don't know what it was like making Giana Sisters for the developer, but I have the feeling that they had the blueprint of Super Mario Brothers, and they just had to make something that kind of looked roughly the same. And I think they did a pretty good job, but you can sort of tell that it's not quite there, you know? With a bit of extra time, it could have been better. But there you go, it's still a perfectly good game. And of course nowadays it's one of those games that's infamous for being taken off shop shelves. So now I'm going to put the Digitune loader tune at the end of the video, and that'll be that. So once again, thank you for watching.